If you love Lost, this video is for you. If you hate Lost, this video is also for you. The question we're exploring is, were the Lost writers making the show up as they went along? Now, if you haven't watched part 1, be sure to check that out first, as it explores what went on behind the scenes during the first 3 seasons of the show. In this second part, we are diving headfirst into the last 3 seasons of Lost, to try and ascertain how much of it was actually thought about ahead of time, versus made up without any real planning. There's going to be some hot takes in this part, so strap yourself in and let's head back to the island together. So what exactly was the endgame plan for the series? Well, first and foremost, the fundamental part of the final phase that the writers had been planning was Jack's death and his eye closing as the final shot in the show. As Lindelof explained to Collider,
we knew a bunch of things. One of the things that we knew for a very long time was that the series was going to end with Jack's death. That would be the end of the, of his arc, as it were, to use screenwriter speak. But the symmetry of starting with his eye opening and ending with his eye closing felt like really good to us. But then, because Lost was a show that really reveled in nonlinear storytelling and liked to jump around in time, we started to become very enamored of the idea that although the final image of the final season would be Jack's eye closing, that we could show his entire experience post-death in some way, Trojan horsed inside the show. And how could we hide it? How could we actually give the audience what we felt like the audience had been demanding from the pilot, which is this purgatory? Are they all dead? So when someone asks you a question, I believe, because this is how it is with me, they're really telling you what they want.
This had been on the cards for a very long time, with the intention to structure the last few seasons around his conversion from man of science to man of faith. And the road to his conversion started as far back as the season 1 finale during that classic Jack versus Locke debate.
I don't believe in destiny. Yes, you do. You just don't know it yet.
The writers' room had also been working towards the idea of some of the oceanic survivors leaving the island, but then wanting to come back after years away. This is why we see Penny searching for the island at the very end of the second season. It's a direct setup for the rescue arc to come. They just couldn't pull the trigger on that specific storyline until ABC agreed on an end date, because it would be nigh on impossible to put that genie back in the bottle after opening it. And if they had to drag the story out for another 6 or 7 years, then what would be the point of even introducing it at all? The characters may as well just be stuck on the island for the foreseeable future. So there were key broad strokes that were up on the board, but the writers really needed to start mapping out those last 3 seasons in detail. Season 4 would of course focus on the rescue and flash forwards to the future. Season 5 would be about finding a way to return to the island and time travelling to the past, and Season 6 would lift the curtain up on the flash sideways to take us into the afterlife. Now, the specific details of each season were ultimately malleable. The writers ended up changing and sometimes even retconning these ideas as they went along, but they always had a strong idea of where they wanted this story to ultimately finish and the narrative beats they needed in order to get there. But let's really drill down into the details here, as I'm fond of doing on this channel. In the Season 3 finale, Jack visits Locke's coffin in the flash forward. Now, we didn't know that it was Locke in that coffin at the time, but the writers did, which means they were thinking about where the arcs of both these characters were going to go in future plotlines. Season 4 continues the idea that Locke is being manipulated towards his death by whatever it is occupying that cabin, and Season 5 explains how his death happened. Meanwhile, the smoke monster being more than just a security system was being recalibrated alongside Locke's arc. It's pretty clear that from the moment the coffin was introduced, the writers had in mind many of these plot mechanics. The last 3 seasons all revolve around very specific plot lines, with very specific goals. Season 4 became about the flash forwards, and revealing who got off the island, how they got off the island, and what happened to them during their time back home. There is no way the writers could have written the flash forward heavy storylines without thorough planning and forethought. This structure by its very nature dictates that they needed to know where they were going. Each event in the on-island present would have a butterfly effect going into the future and vice versa, depending on what we would see first. Season 4 also deals with the ramifications of the Kahana freighter's arrival, and the mysteries associated with who sent it, who was on it, and what they were all after. And this tied directly back to Charles Widmore's introduction in Season 2, and the ultimate revelation that he was a former leader of the Others, and was engaged in a power struggle with Ben. This season also sets the stage for John Locke's death, and the trigger point for physical time travel, and primes the Oceanic Six in the flash forwards to return to the island. Season 5 became about executing the time travel plotlines, and finally establishing the nature of why Destiny works the way that it does. We see the characters who were left behind interacting with key events in the island's historical timeline, through which the writers could depict and explain some of the untold backstories of the things that went on there. Specifically, the missing pieces of the Dharma Initiative are filled in some more, as is the nature of the incident, all of which had been established back in episode 3 of the second season. Elsewhere, we would see the Oceanic Six find their way back to the island and their friends, completing the trajectory teased at the end of Season 3 with Jack's iconic "We have to go back."
We have to go back!
We also see how Locke dies, which is a death that makes the endgame with the Man in Black possible, and reveals the smoke monster as the show's uber big bad. Admittedly, some fans were turned off by the time travel, but it had been established 2 seasons prior with Desmond's episode Flashes Before Your Eyes, then reinforced in Season 4 episode The Constant, which is widely considered one of the best episodes of the entire series, so time travel had been foreshadowed multiple times.
Whoa. You hear how clear that is? It's gotta be close, right?
Radio waves at this frequency bounce off the ionosphere. They can travel thousands of miles. It could be coming from anywhere.
Or any time.
Now, the writers' room could not simply make Season 5 up without any planning, because so much of the time travel required many setups and payoffs. For example, they had to introduce Jughead in episode 3 so that it could be detonated in episode 17. And they also had to carefully consider the time flashes that place our losties inside the island's history in such a way that doesn't contradict previously established lore, at least not without some get-out clauses included.
He'll forget this ever happened, and that his innocence will be gone.
There are certainly some retcons that are deployed during this part of the narrative, but the writers certainly could not have crafted the incredibly intricate plot of this season without extensive preparation and planning. Time travel story arcs with multiple strands and characters need a lot of forethought to add up. I believe that the time travel in Season 5 certainly does add up in terms of logistics. Whatever happened is a much cleaner and easier way of doing time travel than multiverses. But they played up the ambiguity around whether or not the past could be changed, and through that clever misdirection about changed futures and parallel timelines, they managed to disguise their plans to depict the afterlife in their final season. Because the last leg of their plan was revealing the Flash sideways, which would fulfill the supernatural side of the equation. This way they could show us that rather than the island itself being purgatory, as many assumed, it was actually an axis mundi, keeping existence in balance, with the island acting as the link between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead, and they could finally reveal their concept of the island being a cork, which had long since been used as a metaphor in discussions behind the scenes. To explain all this, they roll out their key mythological figure Jacob, who was first mentioned in episode 6 of Season 3.
Shepard wasn't even on Jacob's list.
And through him, the writers answer one of the biggest questions of the series. Why are these characters on this island, and what exactly is their grand destiny? I think it's worth noting that this concept of a cork plugging up a leak that could potentially end existence if removed was already established back in Season 2 with the hatch. The Swan Station itself was the cork, preventing a smaller pocket of this energy from destroying the world.
Here's the real question, Desmondo. Do you have the courage to take your finger out of the dam and blow the whole thing up instead?
In fact, a lot of the setups and plans from the Season 2 days were ultimately fulfilled, even though parts had to be adjusted along the way for various reasons. Damon Lindelof discusses some of this when speaking to Vulture. There were certain things that we were already guided by and locked in on. The first conversations about the character who ended up being the Man in Black were all synonymous with, what is the monster? Those conversations were happening as early as that mini-camp for the writers after Season 1. The idea that the island was a cork, like literally stopping up hell. We were all Buffy fans, particularly in the season when Goddard and Fury were hanging around quite a bit. We did refer to the island as being a cork in the Hellmouth. By the time Jacob explains that to Richard Alpert in the final season, that was an idea that was there for a very long time. For extra context there, Drew Goddard and David Fury were two writers who worked on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, a show about characters living in a town that was essentially residing over the gateway to hell. We know that they were interested in the supernatural from the start, as explored in The Truth About Lost Part 1, but hints that the island was an Axis Mundi can be found in scenes throughout those first 3 years. Voices of the dead whispering in the jungle. Mentions of heaven and hell.
I hear you're a priest.
Yes.
Guess you believe in hell, then.
Little hot for heaven, isn't it?
Oh, okay. So we're dead.
If this isn't hell, friend, then where are we?
And characters being punished in purgatory.
Who do you think is punishing us? Fate.
These are all elements that the writers claim were part of their endgame plans, and we can see evidence of those things being set up and teased across the first 3 years. Some of the issues that a TV show faces can be related to factors beyond the creative control of a writer. Sometimes there are casting issues that cause big seismic changes, as there was with Mr. Echo, as played by Adewale Akinnuoye-Agbaje. It has been well documented how the actor wanted off the show during Season 2, which thereby rendered all of the plans for his character totally inert. The showrunners have spoken about how they had a 3-season arc planned for him, but due to the actor's insistence they write him off the show, they had no choice but to bring his character arc to a very premature end.
We had this character on the show, Mr. Echo, who was an amazing character. The writers spent a tremendous amount of time kind of figuring out exactly how we were going to introduce him into the show and how he would have a multi-seasonal arc and different relationships with different characters. And in the second season, we started setting all this stuff up. And, you know, in around January, Adewale Akinnuoye-Agbaje, who played Mr. Echo, called us and said, I don't want to be on the show anymore. I just hate Hawaii. I want to go back to London. And we were like, dude, we have this huge plan for you, and you have a contract. And he's like, I don't care, sue me, I'm leaving. And now suddenly, this huge time bomb went off in the middle of all of our best laid plans, because we had this whole thing between he and Locke, we had this whole thing with he and Charlie.
So going into year 3, they took the different planned parts of Mr. Echo's arc and passed them out to new cast regulars, Henry Ian Cusick as Desmond and Michael Emerson as Ben. All we know for sure is that Echo was supposed to have the flashes of Charlie's death in Season 3, not Desmond. And Echo's burgeoning conflict with John Locke ended up being moved over to Ben. So Season 3 originally looked quite different in the planning stages. This one actor's decision had a butterfly effect on a whole season's worth of storytelling, and we'll never know if what we got was better than what was originally intended. Although I wouldn't trade out Desmond and Ben's storylines for anything. But there is a version of Lost that could have been. perhaps one where Mr. Echo was the one to become manipulated by the smoke monster into killing the island's false god Jacob. But ultimately it doesn't matter. This is simply a good example of how long-form storytelling is frequently affected by unforeseeable production issues. No matter how well you plan ahead, you can't control the outcomes of everything. Another example of how external factors forced the creative hands of the writers is with the volcano. In Season 3 we get the first big clue as to what is at the core of the island.
So, once water is added to the bicarbonate, we will get our very own volcanic reaction. Yes?
Is that what happened to the volcano on this island?
Exactly, Annie, but that was a long time ago.
Now this scene is brief, but it comes after the writers had already negotiated their end date, and it was clearly a setup for the series finale that they had been working towards. They knew that the last episode would involve Jack's death, and some big fight between good and evil within the island's cradle of existence. I think it's fair to say that they knew that the heart of the island would be where the series finale would take place at this point. Only instead of going into a cave of light, it was going to be the crater of a volcano, one that had been reactivated by the Man in Black's meddling. However, when it came to executing this epic ending that had been gestating since at least Season 2 or 3, the network put the kibosh on it, saying that it was too expensive for production. Lindelof explained, "The question was always, how do you basically visualise and dramatise the idea that the island itself is all that separates the world from hellfire and damnation? And the answer was the volcano. The volcano had been dormant for the duration of the series, but based on moving into this endgame, the island had become unstable and the volcano was going to erupt. We were going to have lots of seismic activity, and ultimately there was going to be this big fight between the forces of good and the forces of evil, which ended up in the series manifesting as Jack and the Man in Black, in the midst of magma spewing everywhere. ABC was like, guys, we love you and we're letting you end the show, we can't let you bankrupt the network in the process. As a result, the writers had no choice but to recalibrate the volcano to only be seen as a hole in a cavern floor instead. It's not nearly as epic and not initially what they had been setting up and planning, but this all goes back to the fact that they can't control every aspect of production to suit their storytelling needs. It doesn't work like that. I actually think this change was ultimately for the better because it keeps the mystery intact of what is beneath the cork and its aperture. The thing is, we won't always know all the reasons behind creative decisions that we don't like or that don't quite fulfill the original brief. And that makes it hard to judge whether or not the writers are directly to blame for the story issues or if it's more external factors that hindered their plans. Sometimes retcons are a necessary evil, because the story has grown well beyond where it started out, and new solutions are needed to resolve old problems. While other times the retcons are the result of creative hand-wringing that only serves to muddle pre-established parts of the lore. Some of the more obvious retcons in Lost are fairly well known within the fanbase. There are several examples I could cite, whether it be the purge date shifting from 1992 to 1987, making the timeline of events more confusing than they really needed to be, or the nature of the sickness mutating its way through multiple seasons without any clear definition. But I have already discussed those subjects in depth in other videos. There is one specific retcon that I would like to explore as a primary example of an original planned answer being changed as a result of storytelling necessity. This is an early Season 1 mystery that wasn't resolved until very late into Season 6. Now, there is a well-known proclamation that Damon Lindelof and Carlton Cuse made in 2007 in an interview with EW, one that they probably wish they hadn't made in retrospect. Question: what is the meaning or significance of the two skeletons that Jack and Kate found in the cave in Season 1? Carlton Cuse: the answer to that question goes to the nature of the timeline of the island. We don't want to say too much about it, but there are a couple of Easter eggs embedded in the latest episode, one of which is an anagram that actually sheds some light on the skeletons and hints at a larger mythological mystery that will start to unfold later in the season. Side note, the Easter egg they are referring to in this interview is from Season 3 episode Not in Portland, and revolves around the introduction of Mythalos bioscience, which is an anagram for lost time, a foreshadowing of time travel playing a significant role in the seasons to come. Back to the interview. Damon Lindelof. There were certain things we knew from the very beginning. Independent of ever knowing when the end was going to be, we knew what it was going to be, and we wanted to start setting it up as early as season 1, or else people would think that we were making it up as we were going along. So the skeletons are the living, or I guess slowly decomposing, proof of that. When all is said and done, people are going to point to the skeletons and say, that is proof that from the very beginning they always knew that they were going to do this. Now, back in the season 1 episode House of the Rising Sun, when Adam and Eve are first discovered, Jack determines that the skeletal remains are to be no less than 40 to 50 years old based on the deterioration of their clothing. This would put Adam and Eve as dying sometime around the 1960s, or possibly even the 1970s, and as any Lost fan knows, the 1970s belonged to Dharma. So based on the showrunner comments and established in-show information, we can make some assumptions about where this thread was originally going, and deduce a lot about their process for both making, then changing plans. So we know that by season 3 they had introduced time travel as a concept through Desmond's episode, and their interview seems to allude to the idea that they had designs on making at least 2 characters from the main cast become Adam and Eve as a result of time travel, or lost time. Characters who would go back to and end up being trapped in the past, growing old, and eventually dying in Dharma times. Now, fans have speculated for a very long time that this could have been the original plan for Jack and Kate, but Lindelof has made it clear that they always intended for the show to end with Jack's eye closing, so it's unlikely that it would have involved him. The more likely answer is that Adam and Eve would have ended up being another couple on the show. Some speculate Rose and Bernard, although that would have made the white and black stones a little too on the nose. I prefer to think that the original plan was to have Jin and Sun become the skeletons, since Adam and Eve were introduced in the couple's very first centric episode. That would have brought things full circle rather nicely. And I absolutely believe that the writers intended to go this route at the time they were discussing it in that 2007 interview. But something changed those plans when it came to breaking the time travel arcs for season 5, most likely due to the mechanics of how the time travel ended up working and what they were trying to accomplish dramatically with the individual storylines for characters. They appeared to have this answer planned in theory for several seasons in advance, but the practicalities of executing such an idea could no longer be followed through on due to how the plotlines had evolved, so they had to abandon it. And this required them to come up with a new answer that still held mythological significance to the story they were telling. Therefore, Adam and Eve were retconned to be Mother and the Man in Black, who were in fact 2,000 years old. While I find that connection satisfying in its own way since it plays into the biblical illusions made about those skeletons, it's not nearly as satisfying as Adam and Eve being Jin and Sun, or even Rose and Bernard, because that revelation would have felt organic and in keeping with the clues they had been planting around it, both inside and outside of the show. They even get Hurley to give voice to this theory in season 6 episode Lighthouse, perhaps as an in-joke and nod to the many fan theories online that had made this prediction, or even perhaps as a reference to their own initial plans.
What if we time traveled again to, like, dinosaur times? And then we died, and then we got buried here. What if these skeletons are us?
And this is the problem with retconning answers and changing direction. It creates narrative inconsistencies, which unfortunately add fuel to the fire that they were making it up. Now, we'll never know the specific reasons as to why they felt like they had to change this answer, if indeed that was the original answer. We can only accept the fact that they did change it. And at least they came up with an alternate solution that was relevant to the lore and dramatically interesting, rather than ignoring the question altogether and hand-waving it away like they did with the Outrigger. The reason why I'm discussing some of these disconnects and issues with the story is to disabuse people of the idea that I blindly praise this show or think that it's perfect, so therefore have no objective sense of its flaws. But I am well aware of its flaws. I might disagree with people over what those flaws are, but I'm not afraid to discuss them in as objective a way as possible. What this channel is trying to do is explain the mythology of the show using information presented within the narrative and being analytically generous to the creative team by finding ways of reconciling parts of their narrative that don't always connect with other pieces. We know that the narrative was never aimless from season to season. There was always intention behind every plot point established, and even when the characters were stuck in cages and the story was stuck in there with them, we were still seeing glimpses of where this narrative was heading, building the runway for a future return to the island, revealing that the smoke monster could appear as dead people, the first mention of the name Jacob, and the internal dynamics of the others, to name only a few. Whenever discussing the ups and downs of producing Lost, someone inevitably brings up the writers' strike of 2007-2008, and how it severely compromised the telling of the story. But this isn't entirely accurate. The Writers Guild strike only ever interrupted the production of Year 4. While some other shows were certainly truncated or forced to conclude early, the effects that it had on Lost were ultimately fairly minimal. The original plan was to make and run a 16-episode season. By the time the strike hit, there were only 8 episodes completed, which ABC decided to air as originally intended. Then the show was forced to take a hiatus until the strike ended. As a result of these delays, the original order of 16 episodes was shortened to 14, which means 2 additional planned episodes got cut, but they would ultimately get carried over and recalibrated to Year 5. Now, there are indications that those episodes would have given us a flashback-centric story for freighter newbies like Charlotte, who never actually got an episode about her character, and possibly another one for Miles or Faraday, both of whom had their backstories eventually weaved into the fabric of the next season. Lindelof talked about this during the airing of Season 5. He was asked if any material got permanently cut from the show as a result of the strike. This was his answer. I don't think that there's anything that just got basically junked. There's stuff that got truncated, so you're getting the Cliff Notes version of the story, whereas there might have been an entire episode that was Charlotte's flashbacks if there hadn't been a strike. Now you get the story, but not the flashbacks. I think the complete jettisoning of a story plan would take the whole Jenga tower down. We have to do all that stuff to get to where we're going. Nothing was so expendable that you could just say, we couldn't get to this. The show would suffer for it. He cites an example of Michael's story in the 4th season. We wanted to do something that was more redemptive for him than staying with the bomb and allowing Jin to get back on the deck as he was spraying liquid nitrogen onto it. But it ended up having to be that, as opposed to something that was probably more heroic, more emotional, by virtue of the fact that we had to collapse our time frame. Originally we were going to do an hour less than we wound up doing, and we had to beg for that. We were still rolling film like 11 days before it was on the air. It was all we could do to cram everything in there, and you go, what are the major story points you can play? And you need to connect the dots. The primary story focus was on the Oceanic 6, and everyone else had to defer. We had to explain how Jin died, and so that gave us less time for Michael's redemptive arc, and we regret that. So there was a butterfly effect on the show, but the ripples were ultimately minimal, and could be absorbed into Year 5, at least according to Lindelof. Perhaps the only part of the larger narrative that appears to have been dropped permanently as a result of the strike was a rumoured plan to explore more of Ben's backstory. Let me take you back to the DVD commentary for The Man Behind the Curtain again, where the following exchange is made. Carlton Cuse. And here's the other important woman in his life, and that is Annie, who is his fellow classmate. You know, this Annie is going to prove to be very significant in Ben's life. Damon Lindelof. Huge part. And obviously there's a little Easter egg that we caught here. Olivia, the teacher there, mentions a volcano on the island, which will be slightly less important than Annie, but still seismic, if you'll pardon the pun. During the Season 4 hiatus, there was a so-called leak regarding planned storylines to come. Now keep in mind that this leak was never actually confirmed as being legitimate, although it did correctly predict some of the storylines for several yet-to-complete episodes. And according to this leak, Ben's original episode wasn't going to be a flash forward of him recruiting Saeed, but a flash back. It was allegedly going to fill in some of the blanks of his time on the island, primarily to show his relationship with Annie into adulthood and her dying in childbirth, which would have neatly underscored his motivations to solve the pregnancy crisis. Now, if this leak was indeed accurate, and I personally believe it was, then we would have seen several loose plot threads tied up quite nicely there. The only reason I can imagine that this got dropped was due to the writer's strike and the season losing episodes. The timeline became too compressed to explore Ben's backstory, and they needed to show what Ben was up to in the future with Saeed and explain how that dynamic came to be, as it was far more relevant to Season 4's Flash Forward's tapestry. I can only assume that the writers planned to shift the Annie backstory over to Year 5, like they would with Miles and Faraday, but by the time Dead is Dead came around, Ben's emotional focus had moved on to the loss of Alex and his rivalry with Charles Widmore. Therefore, the flashbacks had to reflect those two relationships instead, which makes total narrative sense. Alex and Widmore were more important to where Ben was at in his present-day arc in Season 5, and this is why I think Annie got dropped entirely. She had become redundant. I still believe they absolutely planned this arc out, and that this unconfirmed leak was actually pretty accurate at the time. The writer's strike provided them with a very long break, and in that time I think they reconsidered where they wanted to go. Ultimately, they were delayed in being able to fill in those blanks and complete that part of Ben's timeline, and they simply ran out of time and space for it in Season 5. No pun intended. It does serve as a fitting example as to the nature of how writing Lost actually worked. Sometimes, no matter how much you plan for the future or how well you lay the groundwork, the universe has other plans. But look, I don't want to let these guys off the hook entirely for every story problem that came down the pipe.
You are the man behind the curtain, the Wizard of Oz, and you're a liar.
There has always been criticism that the showrunners lied and misled the fanbase about what to expect and how much would be answered. Part of this is a conflation between what the showrunners actually said versus how the network chose to sell the show. ABC's marketing department made life extra difficult for the writers' room, and they themselves felt they were often misleading. So we can't blame the writers for things like,
"The time for questions.
Why is my name written down on this?
Is over.
I promise I'll tell you everything."
ABC's Lost, the final season.
Because that was the studio's way of keeping viewership up, constantly teasing and promising. However, there are documented instances of Lindelof and Cuse making contrary statements about the mythology. This is why I don't bring in too many creator quotes to back up every little explanation, especially if they are quotes made during the first few years of the series, chiefly because there are too many contradictions. Their explanations outside of the show as it was airing, and even since it ended, aren't always simpatico with the evidence presented in-universe. Which is why all that matters to me when coming up with these hypotheticals is the text itself. Now, I can forgive these instances more because, as I have demonstrated in this video, the mythology was always in a state of flux as they wrote it, and they had to be open to making changes, which is simply the nature of the network TV beast. But what we really need to address here in this section are the more egregious instances of Lindelof and Cuse getting caught out for telling lies that were later exposed as such. Okay, there are occasions in which they lied so as not to spoil future plot lines, or they would reject certain fan theories and shoot down questions that might have a basis in truth to avoid giving the game away too soon, while other times they would lie more playfully so as to tease the fans about what was coming up next. I don't think anyone can really begrudge these kinds of white lies, as they are designed to tease and to maintain the secrets of the writer's room. You don't really want to know how the magic trick is done before you see the trick, right? The real issue that we have to address is when they lied to cover up production or continuity errors. Perhaps the most infamous lie they told centered on the actress Rebecca Mader, who played Charlotte Lewis. In Season 4 episode Confirmed Dead, Ben claims that her birthday is July 2nd, 1979.
Her name is Charlotte Lewis. Charlotte Staples Lewis. Born July 2nd, 1979, Essex, England.
But later we are shown Charlotte as a little girl running around the barracks in 1974. When questions around this continuity error were brought up, Lindelof and Cuse initially assigned partial blame to Maida, indicating that she changed the date on set without permission because she didn't want to play an older character. But this statement was later retracted after being publicly called out by Maida, and good for her. Dalton apologised, and rightly so, although they maintain that the 1979 date mentioned in Confirmed Dead was indeed a mistake, or a production error. And sure, maybe it was. Maybe they always intended Charlotte to be an early 70s kid, but it is a little bit suspicious, and they didn't help their case by trying to hang it all on Maida's vanity. Here's what they said on the official podcast.
So we're going to start by issuing a podcast apology and a mea culpa to Rebecca Mader, a wonderful actress who was on our show, and we messed up.
We should have a segment called Our Bad, and you need to find a sound, Chris, that sounds like wah, wow. So it goes, Our Bad, wah, wow, and now... Rebecca, we are very sorry. We had our facts absolutely wrong about our information in the last podcast. What happened is when we originally were auditioning for Charlotte, we were bringing in actresses in their late 30s and early 40s. We wrote the first draft of Confirmed Dead. Charlotte was born in 1970 or 71. When we cast Rebecca and wrote the script, Greg Nations, our continuity expert, came in, basically said to us, Rebecca Mader was actually born on July 2nd, 1979. Let's just use her birthday. We said, sure, and we misremembered the story as having come from Rebecca because they were, in fact, shooting the scene the next day. So Rebecca never read a page that didn't say 1979.
Right. And she did an awesome job on the show and, in fact, won the part over a bunch of actors who were older. Because we loved her so much, we actually reconceived what we thought the character should be because we so much wanted to have Rebecca on the show.
She wasn't even British, in fact, Charlotte, at first.
Correct, exactly.
So it's our bad. We apologize, and we're moving on.
Well, I think the truth is more likely that originally they had the birth date canonically as 1979 because they hadn't yet worked out the architecture for the time travel to come, nor had they properly settled on what exact years our losties would travel to. Those were specifics to be worked out in Year 5, a problem for another season. And when they finally got around to mapping the time travel events out in all of their detail, they started coming up against timeline problems. It's also possible that during Season 4 they had no intention of killing Charlotte off in Season 5, and they only decided to do it in order to change Daniel Faraday's trajectory, so that he would have a strong emotional motivation to want to actively change the past. And for that, Charlotte needed to die. And both he and we needed a reminder about what he had lost, which is when little Charlotte pops up to give us all a wave. It works as an emotional moment, and it's absolutely relevant to where Faraday's emotional story is at and needs to go, but it does come at the expense of continuity. Now, I'm willing to forgive continuity errors, and there are plenty of them in Lost, some minor, some more major. The problem that I have is when the showrunners dodge accountability for such errors by scapegoating others. You were called the showrunners for a reason. You have to bear the blame for the failures as much as you accept the praise for the successes. It's okay to admit mistakes. So the Maida story doesn't really help causes like mine. As transparent as Lindelof and Cuse have been about how Lost was written, they have been known to make things worse for themselves through their interviews and podcasts. Even when they get it embarrassingly wrong, as they did in this case, and they issue mea culpas or denials, it taints that trust that has been established between the storytellers and their audience. It leads to the creation of anti-fans, people who hate on Lost and use many of these quotes against the creative team. I can understand that there was immense pressure for these guys to know absolutely everything and be on top of this huge narrative at all times, and if there was any hint that they could drop the ball on the details, it would be used as a smoking gun against the show. They feared igniting a backlash that could torpedo ratings, especially when they were so close to actually completing their story. So by wanting to maintain the trust of their loyal fanbase, they said and did some misleading and dismissive things over the years, which itself became an ironic betrayal of trust anyway, and these were errors in both storytelling and judgment. I think Lindelof and Cuse loved their fandom, but they also feared their fandom.
But also because the audience was constantly threatening to leave, you know? Like, there were dual parallel tracks of, I love this show, I can't wait for Wednesday night, and if you make like 2 bad episodes in a row, or I start to get the sense that you're making it up as you go along and you don't have satisfying answers to these mysteries, I am going to bail on you. So it was sort of like, I love you, baby, but just so you know, you're one mistake away from me bouncing out of this relationship. So it was a very anxious time.
I suppose there is a reason they haven't sat down and explained their intentions behind everything and state that they would rather the show spoke for itself, which essentially means that all the information we need is in the text. And I think they say that because they don't want to trip over their own feet. Lost is full of potential plot landmines for them if they say the wrong thing, because we've all watched it so closely, and we're often ready to pounce. So we, the audience, have one of two choices. You can choose to be generous to the writers and their intentions, and maintain good faith that, while ideas evolved and changed over time, they had specific meaning and intention behind every element they ever introduced, but didn't always stick the landing. Or you can view them as con men who winged their way through 6 years of writing scripts, production plans, fan events and Q&As, media interviews and podcasts, lying through their teeth at every opportunity just for the funsies, yet somehow still managed to make a show that is emotionally involving and surprisingly coherent in spite of the fact they were cynical hucksters out to hoodwink us all. I ask you, which one of these scenarios seems more likely or believable? That part's for you to decide. I guess if anyone was ever going to expose Lost as being a con job, I imagine it would have been those who had negative experiences behind the scenes. The writers who have personal grievances with Lindelof and Cuse could very easily have torched the legacy of the whole show if they wanted to. They had the opportunity to speak out and say, oh, and by the way, they were totally making it up as they went along. Yet several of these former collaborators who left the writer's room feeling persecuted or maligned have gone on to say they are immensely proud of their work on the show, and as well they should be. Javier Grillo-Marxuach was one of these writers who admonished the showrunners for their management style and attitudes, and yet he has also stated the following in his Lost Will and Testament document. At the risk of extreme arrogance, I would put the first season of Lost alongside any accomplishment in television drama, including those of the idols who made me want to work in the medium. Even though I quit the show after its second season, never to watch it again until the series finale, I have never ceased to be fiercely proud and defensive of our accomplishments as a writing staff and those of the show's creators. This is how the battle of 22-episode-a-year network television is fought and won, not by relying on lone geniuses to come up with everything, though sometimes they do, but by relying on the geniuses to inspire their staffs, which hopefully comprise a few geniuses, with great ideas that generate tons of further ideas, some good, some bad, and some downright insane, and then cherry-pick the best of the best and integrate them into the show. What Javier's detailed recollections do remind us all of is that Lost was a team effort, even when that team didn't always get on, and whether those recollections be positive or negative, they all help to give more context to the show's making and its ultimate legacy. So where does that leave us as a fan base? Where does it leave the show and its lasting legacy? Well, sometimes audiences can think more deeply about a work of fiction that they love than the people who created it. Whether or not this applies to the Lost writers, I don't really know. I tend to believe they knew what everything meant by the end and could easily validate or dismiss the ideas on this channel one by one. When retrospectively discussing their imperfectly shaped diamond of a story, they have not been without self-deprecation or brutal honesty. Damon Lindelof in particular continues to be incredibly frank about the experience of pulling this whole thing together, and it's clear that he cared very deeply about the story being told, and the audience's reaction to it. As much as people have said very kind things about how I put things together, I honestly don't think I'm making up too much of my own headcanon to fill in the gaps. So much of what I am drawing on comes from information presented within the text itself. There is always a scene or a line or a moment I can point to in order to back up my analysis. That's not to say it always adds up, of course, but it adds up more often than it doesn't. A lot of the answers are fairly straightforward when we really look back on the mysteries that first seemed impossible to figure out. As for those who claim that the show left many questions unanswered, you really need to consider just how many questions were actually answered. It's very easy to forget that back in Season 1 we had questions about who was the French woman? What is the monster in the jungle? Where did the polar bear come from? What caused the plane to crash? Why was Locke in a wheelchair? Who were Adam and Eve? Where did the cable on the beach go to? What was in the hatch? What happened to the tail section passengers? How did the Black Rock end up in the middle of the island? What are the backstories of these survivors? These were the burning questions, all of which were answered. By season 2, our questions turned more to things like, who are the others? What was the Dharma Initiative? What was the incident? Who is that Desmond guy? What happened to Claire when she was kidnapped? What happened to Russo's baby? Is Henry Gale telling the truth? Who is the leader of the others? Again, all of these were revealed and explored in great detail. By the end of season 3, our questions were, who is on the freighter? How did Jack and Kate get off the island? Who was in the coffin? Why did Naomi claim that all the oceanic passengers were dead? Why has Richard Alpert not aged? Who is in the cabin? And who or what is Jacob? Once again, all of these were answered to varying degrees of completeness. These were all considered massive mysteries by viewers for the first few years, and slowly but surely they were addressed and explored. And it's very easy to forget that fact by the end of the show when we suddenly get hung up on more esoteric questions, such as why did the Egyptians build the Taweret statue? What was the purpose of the temple? And who installed the cork? Or even the more nuanced complexity of questions like, can Jacob see the future? And was Mother a smoke monster? The major questions were absolutely answered, even if the answers were sometimes malleable. Writing TV is a different beast to writing a book or even a stage play. It's hard to be a sole author like a Stephen King or a Michael Crichton. Writers who have the clout and reputations to indulge in their creative processes and develop and perfect their stories over long periods of time. There's no time in the TV world to do any of that, and the showrunners may have been writing about an island, but they were never an island unto themselves.
You have to remember that we're not writing a novel where the characters will do whatever we ask them to, and not just that, but we write something and the actors give us so much back that we're sort of in the business of not making off-the-rack suits. We're tailoring the suits, and the fun part is doing the alterations constantly.
So I think the first point to take away from this is that Lost was a collaboration of voices across different disciplines. Sure, Lindelof and Cuse were in charge of the creative process, but they were not infallible, and we as audiences should not deify nor canonise creative people in the business as being godlike geniuses. For anyone who has ever tried to write a story, your initial plans almost always change, and that is just with one script or book or short story. Never mind across 120 plus episodes of narrative television, written in collaboration with over 30 other writers across 6 years. As a result, the show is going to be uneven in places. There are most definitely going to be inconsistencies and continuity errors, most of which are things that only hardcore fans ever pick up on. But it is up to the individual viewer to decide how generous they are willing to be in trying to incorporate such issues into the narrative and finding in-canon explanations for them. Of course, some of the answers the show provided were sometimes more nebulous, which allowed fans to have more than one interpretation. Sometimes the questions and answers are nebulous by design, because the writers want us to argue about whether or not Mother was a smoke monster. And other times they are nebulous because the writers tripped over their own narrative. But to say that the show was made up as they went along, or that it never answered its questions, is simply not accurate, nor is it fair. There is clear evidence that this story had considered thought and planning put into it, that there was a mythology created and used in pieces across the 6 seasons. I mean, the level of detail in some of the show is truly next level. Just look at the hieroglyphs. They appear throughout the series, and their translations help us to understand the unseen history and chronology of the island's past. Ask yourself, why would the writer's room invest that much energy and detail into things like pictures on a wall in the background of a scene, something that most casual viewers will never notice? Why would they do that if they weren't discussing and thinking about the story in depth behind the scenes? I'd understand this argument a bit more if all the hieroglyphs turned out to be gibberish, or if they translated into in-jokes that said things like "made you look" or "nothing to see here," but they don't. The The writers respected their audience. They wanted us to be invested in their story. I believe I have demonstrated on this channel how pretty much everything in Lost is ultimately explainable, and most of it comes from using established narrative facts, and connecting the dots between plot points, revelations, and implications. I couldn't explore half of what I explore unless I had the essential baseline data to begin with. Now, other fans have figured out different elements from the show for themselves, or found their own readings and interpretations that work. It just takes effort and analysis to do so. I don't think I'm unique in putting in that kind of work to a story that is complex and full of moving parts. The plot points that unlock the meaning of the story are all there, and I back up as much of my explanations with that in-show evidence as possible. Some answers are self-evident and outright stated,
I think I crashed your plane.
while others are more complicated to unwrap. The creative team wanted us to understand just enough, but they also wanted us to keep talking about it long after it ended, to think beyond the credits and use our imaginations to untangle the parts of the story that they did not untangle for us. The ambiguity around some of the mythological elements is what has helped Lost to endure long after its conclusion. Think of other mystery shows that have followed in its wake. How many still inspire fierce and passionate debates? How many do you even remember or go back to rewatch or still think about? The stories that mechanically explain themselves inside and out have long since been forgotten and consigned to obscurity. Even the trolls who leave angry comments under my videos declaring that Lost was a waste of time are still thinking about it years after it ended and looking for explanations. So it is within the ambiguities of Lost that it has gained a life beyond its finale. The story was constantly oscillating between what it wanted to be, what the network was trying to get it to be, and what the fans expected it to be. And here's the point I would like to end this analysis on. To all the naysayers who complain about how convoluted Lost was, to those of you who curdled on the series by the end and continue to tell everyone about the sour taste it left behind, even all these many years later, I'll let you in on a little secret. To the rest of us, Lost is still fun. It's still fun to talk about it and pick apart its many threads. It's still fun to try to think about and consider the intentions of the writers. It's still fun to be theorising about the minor details. It's still fun to debate the differences of opinion on the more ambiguous mysteries and their possible solutions. We get to participate in the storytelling for as long as we want. Because Lost didn't really end for us in 2010, it kept on going, and it invited us along to become part of its storytelling tapestry. I'd say to anyone who fell out of love with the show to just try and remember how much you once enjoyed the speculation and the theory crafting, having conversations with other fans, applying your own imagination. Well, you can still get to do that, and that is what I love about the show, and it's what the haters have long since forgotten that they once loved about it too. If my videos have either clarified, improved, or enriched the narrative for the loyalists or the skeptics, then that's about as much as I could hope for. And now that you are armed with the explanations and information from my Theory of Everything videos, I recommend doing a rewatch of the show, especially if you only ever sat through it once. Lost rewards repeat viewings, and you might just see it in a new light, so to speak. Let's go out on a Lindelof quote. It all goes back to the idea of, are we making it up as we go along? That's the question that people really want to know the answer to, and they want some proof. They want us to document the fact that we weren't making it up as we went along. And in the spirit of the show, we just have to say, if you choose to believe us, then that's what faith is all about. If you choose to disbelieve it, then we don't blame you. At the end of the day, all that matters is the story itself. If you feel satisfied by it, it shouldn't matter whether we had it planned from day one, or whether we made it up as we went along. In other words, trust the tale, not the teller. Please like, share and subscribe to keep this channel alive. I'm launching the Lost episode guide next, which will go through the series episode by episode, mystery by mystery, and you'll finally get to hear some of my critiques of the series. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you back on the island.